Most basic services in Egypt at the moment are not available. So remember, this was in July, so in the midst of the summer heat in Egypt, Ramadan had started, the fasting month, so people were outraged. There was no water in many areas, water cuts all the time, and power cuts all over the country. So imagine in this terrible heat, and people are fasting. Most people are fasting during Ramadan, and there is no water and no electricity. I experienced it myself when I was there. Actually, the first day I arrived in Cairo, I was supposed to stay in a flat on the 11th floor. And my mom told me when I was going there that there was a power cut. So me and my husband thought, okay, what are we going to do? We cannot take up our suitcases to the 11th floor. So we got there around 2 in the morning, and we waited downstairs until the power was back. And this happened repeatedly. So you can imagine the sense of outrage and frustration, disappointment that Egyptians are going through. It's not only water and electricity, it is also gas canisters, which most people use to cook, queues to get gas canisters, very expensive to get them as well, petrol, cars queue to get petrol. Since Morsi came to power, the new elected president, of course people's expectations were high that he would do something at least about the water shortage, even the bread shortage. We still find queues to get bread, and people get into fights and very violent battles to get bread as well. So what I want to say is that all of us in Egypt, whether rich or poor or in urban areas, in remote villages, are suffering from the lack of basic services. And of course, the pressure is a lot higher on the majority of the population who suffer from unemployment and poverty and lack of access to public services, to transportation. These things were not expected to happen after the 2011 revolution. People sacrificed their lives and their sons and daughters and everything they valued. Millions of people in Egypt sacrificed to at least live a life that has got a minimum level of dignity, of social justice. So the main demands of the revolution, which were bread, freedom, social justice, and human dignity, unfortunately, have not been fulfilled. On the contrary, what we see now is a terrible crackdown on civil liberties, on people's basic livelihoods. Those who go out on protests and speak out get arrested and kidnapped. And it's as if we're back to the dark era under Mubarak. Perhaps now things for many people can be perceived as worse, because the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi movements and all these Islamic groups are using religion as propaganda. So on top of the lack of all these services and the pressures on a daily basis, also religion is being used all the time to justify why the government are not able to fulfill the main demands. However, I'm not saying this to say that there is no hope. Of course, people are still fighting on a daily basis, because one important thing that the revolution has achieved is that people are not willing to shut up anymore. So, for example, the people of this small village in Giza would not have been able to do this during the Mubarak regime. They would not even, they wouldn't be able to get to the gates of the Giza governorate. And just for those of you who do not know what this building resembles, it resembles like the townhouse here. So it's the main local city council building. And of course, as you've seen, it is very beautiful and full of riches from the inside. And only a few kilometers away are people living without water. So these inhabitants of Saft al-Laban village decided to take matters into their own hands and go and occupy the governorate building. They kept some of the employees in and closed the gates. So these are the rays of hope that we also see in Egypt at the moment. The people are still fighting. There is still a determination to fulfill the demands of the revolution, to fight for social justice and human dignity. And even though these are broad and abstract concepts, I mean, of course, all of us know what human dignity is, but I mean, concrete examples, like what we've seen. People want to live a dignified life, to at least find water. So since the start of September this month, we've seen a wave of protests again, with the beginning of the school year and the beginning of the university year. Teachers have gone out in their thousands, and they have had a sit-in just in front of the cabinet building in Cairo to demand better wages again, and for casual contracts to be turned into permanent contracts. The promises that they have been given since last year, and the Ministry of Education did not fulfill these promises. So the teachers are out, the public transport drivers are out. They've closed the garages in Cairo, again fighting for better wages and health insurance, and so on. University employees as well, especially in Cairo and in other parts of the country, have been staging protests also to put pressure to get better wages and permanent contracts. But we've seen this wave last year as well. So in September last year, also the teachers went out in their thousands, and the public transport drivers went out, and the university lecturers. There is pressure, but it just seems to me that we need more momentum to keep the revolutionary struggle going. I don't really have an answer to this question. How do we do this? Maybe we can think together about it, and I mean, people in Egypt are thinking all the time about it. But it puzzles me a great deal that after an amazing revolution and all the sacrifices that today we find ourselves in this position. People in Egypt, those who believe in the revolution, maintain the slogan, the revolution continues. And it is in Arabic, Thawra Mustamirra, the revolution continues. We don't really have an agenda or a program for how the revolution will continue. So, I mean, different groups of revolutionaries, different opposition groups interpret this slogan differently. Yeah, but at the foundation, the fundamental, the essence of this slogan is we will keep fighting to improve our living conditions, to have a better future for our children, to have a health system, health insurance, to have jobs, to be able to get electricity and water and so on. The revolution continues in the lives and the daily practices of millions of Egyptians at workplaces, on the streets. There are so many new initiatives by different groups from different political orientations to keep pressure on the president and on the government to improve things. But of course, we have to admit that there are severe setbacks and severe challenges facing the people in Egypt. And I mean, we should not underestimate the dangers and the challenges, because now under Morsi, I mean, they are cracking down on civil liberties and the gains that we have achieved since the revolution. What is also problematic is the divisions we find amongst the leftist forces in the country. There are so many divisions, and people are still unable to get themselves together in a way that people can feel them. What we do not see is that we are unable to have a strong impact in the streets yet, even though the revolutionary left movement has expanded since the revolution. There are so many people who have come into it, and many people who are working very hard to, get in touch with people and try to find some kind of structure or organization for our work on the ground. However, This is a big problem that we are still unable to reach so many sectors. And also there are so many divisions within the labor movement itself. And I think this is the most dangerous aspect here. We see a separation between many political forces, opposition forces, and the labor leaders and people in factories and in government workplaces and so on. I mean, my own fear is that this gap between the revolutionary forces and the labor movement widens. We need to find ways to bring the two together. I think this is the only way forward without the pressure of the economic pressure, the weight of the labor forces, the independent trade union movements, and so on. Without this pressure on the government and on the president, we might find that we will see these repeated protests over a long period of time, repeatedly waves of protests, and then they fade away, and then another wave happens again, and so on. I mean, there are so many. We also need to admit that there are so many questions that we are unable to answer yet as the revolutionary left. We still need to learn so much from the people themselves who've made this revolution. We need to be closer to them, to listen to their demands, try to overcome our divisions. I'm sorry that I have, more questions and puzzles rather than solutions and, straightforward answers to things. But as we say in Egypt, and I will end on this comic saying, which we say, the situation now in Egypt is like when you put milk over fish, and then you put over them a sweet juice. Completely distasteful. You cannot eat it, you do not understand it. We need to separate the fish from the milk, from the sweet juice, and so on. Thank you very much, and we will carry on during the discussion. I think we can expand on more points. Thank you.
What I'm going to concentrate on is actually going to be what Alex pointed out rightly is the central question in any revolution, which is the question of state power. I'm not going to, in the title of my talk it says From People's Revolution to Permanent Revolution. I'm not actually going to address necessarily in detail directly some of the debates we had earlier this morning, but I hope people will bring that in to the discussion later. Because what I wanted to do, what I think is absolutely crucial, is that we have this discussion on the basis of a concrete analysis of what has actually happened to the Egyptian state in the revolution and before the revolution, and to understand the role of the different actors within the revolutionary process in that process of a crisis and then a revolution and then attempts to remake the state from above and from below. When I say remaking the state, I don't mean, as I'll come on to explain, that the attempts from the top are remaking it in the sense that we would want to remake and utterly destroy the existing capitalist state, but in the sense of the changes that are happening as a result of the revolution. I want to start with the question of what role did particularly the workers' struggle play in the development of the revolutionary crisis before the 2011 revolution. Because I think that kind of long perspective is extremely important to understanding what is happening during the revolution itself, because there are continuities as well as ruptures between those two phases, and that there's a long process in that you have, from the mid-1970s onwards, an attempt by a layer of the Egyptian ruling class, led by Anwar Sadat, who was the president who succeeded Gamal Abdel Nasser, and a layer of people around him in the wider Egyptian bourgeoisie, to change the principal means by which capital accumulation was organised. The kind of model that they went from was a state capitalist model to a model that was more neoliberal. And this is a long, drawn-out process, and there is a lot more that you could say about the degree to which it changed and the combination of the state capitalist and neoliberal forms of the state that resulted. But there was a definite shift. And part of that shift involved a change within a constitution of a new ruling class coalition, which included some people who'd been part of the old one, but it also changed some of the roles that they played, and there were some winners and some losers. So it had at its heart a kind of there's an inherent tension within the ruling class at the top. There's inherent tension about who was going to win and who was going to lose out. Obviously, the people who were managing large state enterprises, or the people who were running the bureaucratic trade union federation that was not part of the apparatus of the state, were very clearly going to be losers, a lot of them, out of this process of moving from one model to another. These tensions were latent in the process. They were real, but they didn't actually result in any serious breakdown of the coherence of the Egyptian ruling class, despite waves of economic crisis that afflicted the Egyptian state in the 1970s, then in the late 1980s, and all the difficulties of that transition. The point at which those latent tensions exploded into a very different a different order of crisis and a problem for the ruling class was at the moment when you had the eruption of a mass strike wave. And that in itself also has to be seen in the context of the eruption of waves of mass political protest over other things, over Palestine, over the anti-war movement in 2003 against the invasion of Iraq, over the democratic demands that were raised for changing the nature of the constitution and the widening of the democratic space. Again, there isn't time to really go into this relationship between the political and the social struggles in the pre-revolutionary period, but they're very important that they're seen as part of the same process. However, I would argue that it is the transformatory role in this process is played by the eruption of a wave of mass workers' strikes and struggles from 2006 onwards, in particular the shift towards strike action. What it did was it didn't break down the old state structures. It didn't lead to fracture within the ruling class, within the institutions of the state. But it did paralyse some of the very key mechanisms by which the old order had managed to maintain and to contain workers' protests and contain social and political protests within a framework that they could manage. I mean, this can be seen in the context of the years up to the revolution, of the inability of the state to deal with strikes effectively. Half part of the state were people like Aishat al-Hadi, who's the Minister of Labour, going around negotiating directly with workers' elected strike leaders who were elected directly by the workers. As in the case of the Mahalla strikes in 2006, 2007. Other parts of the state apparatus which had monopolised dealing with the workers' movement for decades, the old Trade Union Federation, were running around trying to by various means of physical intimidation, court battles and so on, to smash the workers' movement and not to allow any space within which new genuine workers' leaders could be allowed to negotiate directly with the state, because it was evidently a huge threat to their own position. Of course, I'm not saying that Aisha Abdel Hadi did this because she is somehow a reformist or better or nicer than Hussein Nagawa, who's the head of the Trade Union Federation. The point is that the state's response to the workers' movement was deeply divided, and I think that that is a reflection of the deep tensions within this shift from a state capitalist to a neoliberal model. When you come to the revolution itself, you get a repetition, in a sense, of some of these same processes in a context which is changed by the mass mobilisation of particularly the urban poor in the uprising against Mubarak. And the order in which things happened during the uprising is an expression of this, that the mass street protests and battles that took place in the first phase of the uprising, it brought hundreds of thousands, millions of people onto the streets. But it was not until you actually had an eruption of a wave of strikes in the last week or so of the uprising that there was any shift at the top of the state. And that shift was very important, but it's important to note its limitations in terms of the actual changes that were brought about as a result of the uprising. Again, there was a sense of paralysis and then a break, in that the leadership of the army was essentially forced to remove Mubarak. But other than that, there was very little change from the top. I'll come on to talk about the significance of some of the changes that have happened more recently since the election of Morsi. But the actual alteration, or the change of personnel after the uprising in February last year was extremely small. I want to, just before I move on to talk further about to put forward an analysis of understanding the period from February 2011 up to June 2012, I want to make some more general points about the character of the pre-revolutionary crisis and the role of the working class within it, and other forms of social struggle. I think that it is absolutely right to say that the organised working class, in the sense of its organic organisation within the workplaces through strikes, played an absolutely pivotal and central role in the crisis of the state, and the crisis would not have happened without it. And that, more than that, the actual forms of struggle, particularly strikes, you could see, if you like, this movement, this organic workers' movement from the workplaces, attained a kind of social hegemony in terms of the struggle that was going on at the level of the social struggle itself. But this was contrasted by complete political silence in terms of workers' voices being heard at a political level, whether that's actually in terms of their role within even opposition groups and so on, where the numbers of people who were the opposition to Mubarak who had any perspective whatsoever of making political relationships or privileging the voices of workers is very, very, very small and restricted to very small layers of the revolutionary left. But nor, of course, were workers' voices being heard politically being heard through other means. And this is a very acute contradiction. You have a roar of the strike action, which, in the cases of workers of the significance of a workplace like Mahalla, what workers do there and the outcome of those strikes and the decisions that are taken have a political impact because of the concentration of 24,000 workers in that workplace, because the symbolic resonance of Mahalla as a site of struggle within the history of the workers movement, all sorts of reasons why that can happen. But that's not the same as having a coherent, a loud political voice of their own, and that contradiction characterised the pre-revolutionary period. If we come to the period after the fall of Mubarak, up until, I would argue, around June this year into July, August this year, that, as I said a minute ago, it's really important, I think, to understand that that's characterised fundamentally by the fact that the people changed and the state didn't. That the degree of change from above was extremely small. There were constant attempts, masses of attempts, thousands and thousands of strikes, actually, probably, around the issue of changing the state from below, because large numbers of these strikes are taking place in public institutions, in public sector workplaces and so on. And the demand for, what's here, cleansing of the state apparatus is a demand that was raised consistently in very large numbers of strikes. The problem is one of the questions is, does that succeed? Firstly, some of it did succeed at the level of individual workplaces, but it didn't succeed much higher than that as a result of the pressure from below. And what happened from above was very little change. And the consequences of that shape a number of features of the way the revolutionary process developed. If we look at it from the perspective of above first, the fact that you have Tantawi, Annan, and the generals from SCAF in power, having removed Mubarak because he's clearly a danger to the health of the Egyptian state and potentially to its future survival, and they are confronting an insurgent people in the streets who also at this point have gone into the biggest, huge strike wave centred around this question of getting rid of the little Mubaraks in their own workplaces. They need to make an offer to somebody who has some credibility with the revolutionary side, who has some kind of relationship with what's going on in the streets, but is going to listen to them and make a deal with them. And the obvious people to look for, the main reformist forces in the political arena of the Muslim Brotherhood, who combine these features. But it's important to understand the nature of the offer that was made and how limited it was. The combination of the fact that they had got away with removing a surgical operation, it appeared, of removing Mubarak, and then managing to get away without announcing too many sweeping changes, meant that throughout most of the period from February 2011 to June 2012, people like Tantawi and Annan appear to have thought they could get away with a pretty minimal offer to the Brotherhood of a new political settlement that would allow genuine changes in the arena of representative politics. So they would have elections that the state would not attempt to rig in the same way that it had done in the past, that they would be allowing the Brotherhood to dominate the parliament. But when it came to the concrete questions of actual power that mattered in relation to the apparatus of the executive of the state rather than the legislative organs, the governments that were formed up until Morsi came to power, was elected, were governments appointed from above by SCAF. They didn't even include, I don't think, any members of the Brotherhood, I can't remember. It was a mixture of mainly people from the old regime, actually. And a key part of this was attempting to manage something that would look like, I think the hope was, a reborn version of the old regime, which allowed the Brotherhood to take in a sense, the heat from the streets and in the electoral arena, but meant there was almost no change within the actual state itself. Now, of course, you have to understand as well the importance of the dynamic process of the revolution, that the huge blow that the uprising against Mubarak struck on the body of the state meant that for the first 6 or so months, up until November, December last year, it was unclear whether the state would, as a result of that blow, further break down, whether ruptures would happen within the body of the army, between different sections of the state, and so on. That there was a sense that the state was very badly damaged, and that there were lurches in the way that the people at the top of it were behaving that suggested that analysis was right. And there was also a sense of paralysis. After the failure, in a sense, of the November uprising last year to translate into a new crisis within the state that forced further breakdown, you see a massive, in a sense, a trajectory that's going the other way towards greater coherence and stability within the state. Relatively speaking, the army looks much more confident. The army leadership looks much more confident in dealing with pressures from within the army. They managed to, for example, there's a guy called Ahmed Shuman, who's one of the soldiers. He's a junior officer, went to Tahrir in February during the uprising, and announced that he was resigning live on Al Jazeera and called on Tantawi and Mubarak to resign and so on. It was really quite a pivotal moment in the development of the revolution, because it was uniformed officers taking part in the uprising. He also went to Tahrir in November. In February, he was threatened with a court-martial process and so on, but actually the Tantawi and co withdrew from really prosecuting him. After November, he ended up going to jail for 8 years. And that there are a number of other episodes like that, which are signs of the dynamic change in what's happening in the state. And interleaved with this, the understanding of this, though, is that at the same time, because the degree of change at the top is so small, that there is a radicalising process that goes on in the streets, that the levels of mobilisation in terms of street protests and strikes remain incredibly high. They come they come in waves. As Dalia said, one of the biggest strike waves was in September last year, but there have been several others since. There have been several waves of incredibly large street protests, which are repeated time and time again. My argument would be is that essentially this ended up in a stalemate, that what the situation that was unfolding towards June earlier this year was that you had a counter-revolutionary part, the parts of the state, the old regime, that wanted to carry out a proper counter-revolution, including ones who probably wanted to carry out a Chile-style bloodbath-type counter-revolution, were actually gaining in confidence. The entry of Ahmed Shafiq into the electoral process and the fact that he nearly won is a sign of that. It was a very serious attempt to crystallise, both, and hedging their bets, by the way. I mean, they weren't exactly going to just sit back and necessarily let Ahmed Shafiq lose without also attempting other forms of, or at least threatening other forms of moving against the revolutionary movement. I think that at that point, some people within the top of the state probably blinked and thought, actually, we can't do this. The level of mobilisation from below is too high for us to risk what that could do to our own internal organisation and coherence, that we cannot, at this stage, carry out that kind of option in terms of counter-revolution. We have to, therefore, make a new offer to the only people who can stand between us and the masses, still the Brotherhood, on a slightly different basis. And that you have, therefore, a kind of contradictory essence of what happened in June around the elections. On the one hand, as an expression of the incredibly high levels and continuing high levels of mobilisation, street protests, strikes, and so on. It's also an expression of their failure to synchronise with each other, of the separations of the economic and the political struggles, of the subjective weaknesses of the revolutionary movement in terms of its organisation and consciousness, and of the importance of linking these struggles. And I think that double understanding of what happened is very important, because there is there is concretely a new phase has opened in the Egyptian revolution after June, which is still a phase where it's open to what the outcomes could be, and that's extremely important. I would see, firstly, concretely, in terms of the changes that have been made at the top to be taken into account. I mean, for example, I mentioned in terms of a change of personnel at the top, what Morsi announced and was carried through in August in terms of the sacking of Tantawi and Annan and the heads of, not only them, but the heads of all the various different branches of the armed forces, was really quite a radical clear out, and new people were promoted. They're only being promoted from the level just below in the state. It's not that they are new people who come in from outside, but it is actually a significant shift, because it's the kind of changes that you might expect and have seen in other revolutionary processes might happen week 2, week 3, week 4. It depends on the specific historical circumstances. But it's a testament to the very slow degree of change from above, that this is only happening 18 months into into the revolutionary, more than 18 months into the revolutionary process. But the kind of changes that it involves also give the Brotherhood an opportunity to put down some roots within the state. I think this is a crucial aspect of understanding the development of the relationship between the Brotherhood and the military over the period between the fall of Mubarak and June last year, is that if you see the Brotherhood and the military as essentially being simply one hand, you can't understand the conflicts between them. That the instability of their relationship is an expression of the fact that the Brotherhood, even despite the cowardliness of its leaders and the fact that it wants to compromise and do a deal with the military council, cannot guarantee that it's not going to be on the receiving end of the counter-revolution unless it has better purchase within the state. And that this is an extremely important point. The other factor, of course, is that the Brotherhood is under pressure from a mass movement from below, which is a pole of attraction pulling sections of its own mass membership and its electorate and the people it needs to relate to. So there are two sides to this to this contradiction. But the instability of that relationship between the Brotherhood and the military is central to understanding, I think, the development of the revolutionary process, because it also shows ways in which the thing can turn back into a direction which is more favourable to the kind of permanent revolution that we want. I want to just finish in the last few minutes by, therefore, a few kind of points to pull this together and pose some more questions. This is very unfinished and preliminary kind of discussions on an unfinished revolution. As I mentioned before, I think it's important to understand the character of the period since the fall of Mubarak until June this year. That the combination of very little change from above and the general weakness and newness of the workers' movement and other organisations which might have been able to bridge the gap between the social and the political struggles has actually been an accelerant to both the radicalisation of some sections of a very large revolutionary movement which drew extremely radical conclusions in relation to the military very quickly, and that threw itself very courageously into battle against the state repeatedly over the last year. But one of the consequences of this of this combination is that it deepens the problems of unevenness within the movement, as Dalia talked about. It's very problematic and difficult the process of overcoming the separation between, in a sense, people's political and economic selves has proved to be a very difficult feature of the revolutionary process, by which I mean that for some people, to a certain extent, people engaged in strikes, people engaged in street protests, some kinds of street protests are different people. That's a fact, that is one of the features of the way the movement's developed. But in some cases, they're the same people. In a lot of cases, there are lots of people, a very large number of people, who will be organising strikes in their workplaces in the morning, and then in the afternoon or after work or on Friday will be going and taking part in the mass mobilisations in Tahrir Square or in their local square and so on, who identify with the revolution. But what they don't see is that they have the means within the workplace, within their own being as workers, as organised workers in particular, a means to advance the goals of the revolution. That argument has made so far very little progress, unfortunately, and that is, to my mind, one of the primary problems that we face in terms of seeing how the revolution can go. Just the very final point really is, what are the likely issues and points where you can see the possibility of rupturing the membranes between economic and political struggles, out of which you can start to get a dynamic which then moves in a direction towards permanent revolution of the kind that we were discussing in the first session. And one of those is the question of Patir, is the question of remaking the state, because it is still an absolutely central feature of most of the strikes, and particularly most of the coordinated sector-wide strike action that takes place. The question of getting rid of the people from the old regime who still dominate the structures and the institutions in which people work is absolutely central to that demand. But there are actually other ways as well. There are other issues. The central one of these, of course, is the question of the economy and neoliberalism, and that the Brotherhood is offering itself to Egyptian capitalism as a means not merely to continue Egyptian capitalism, but actually to deepen the neoliberal revolution, to potentially to clear out the debris of the bits of the Nasserist state that got in the way for so many years. And actually, if the revolution fails to go in the direction that we want it to go towards social justice, that will be one feature of it. But there is a huge degree of struggle that is still to erupt over this, because of the combination of the levels of incredible high mobilisation by people who won't, as the residents of South Laban in that case, over the question of water shortages, who won't shut up anymore, who will organise and fight over this. And the question of neoliberalism feeds itself into so many things, whether it's the abolition of consumer subsidies, of the subsidies on bread and cooking gas, but also over the question of privatisation, also over the question of when they get of cuts in the in-state spending, and so on and so forth. I'll finish there because I think we should open up and have an opportunity for discussion, but I think that that's an attempt to try and sketch out some concrete changes that I see as central to understanding what's happening in this state as a result of the revolution and from before.